When you spend a lot of time with census records and you start looking at how people respond to them, when you look at how companies respond, when you look at what the Census Bureau expects, it turns out like these people who are building these data sets don't expect that they're getting a perfect representation or something that's fully accurate. They know that they're dealing with enumerators who are not perfectly trained. They know that the categories that they're rolling out are often not quite fine-grained enough to actually fit the experiences of all the people that live in this wide, woolly world.
Yeah.
And like for businesses, it's even more interesting because oftentimes they're asking for business data that the business wouldn't have had time to actually have formally calculated yet, because the end of the fiscal year is going to be different than the census year. And so the Census Bureau is saying, well, just give us an estimate of what you think these numbers are going to be. And so one of the reasons why you want to have this kind of split between individual records and statistical records is because if you get a whole bunch of individual records that are not perfect and you put them all together, thanks to the law of large numbers, bam, we've got good statistics, or pretty reliable statistics, can tell something interesting about the world. But each of those records is actually not a good representation of the individual. And so we want to preserve confidentiality and privacy, in part just because like those records were not meant to represent people in the real world. They were meant to build statistics.
Yeah, that is such a good point. Over and over again, I have to tell people when I'm looking at ACS data or the census data, it's good enough for what we're using it for. And I'm not drilling down to an individual. So when it says a certain number, that's not the number. That is an estimate for a population or a sample. And we're using it as basically a paintbrush to tell us about that area. And that's a hard thing for people to connect to. And I think you did that very well. We are literally collecting data to create statistics. And, including, when we're looking, when I'm looking at healthcare related data, especially if it's CDC related, CDC Places is a perfect example. That data is just phenomenal. But when it says 47% of the people have hypertension, well, it's not 47%. But that 47% is higher than 18%. And I feel pretty good that 18% is not going to be so wrong in our calculations that it's actually higher than that 47. So it allows us to see what we want to see. And I think that's really, really important to make that distinction. And, just like with income now, I mean, it could really go into sampling, right? And now they use sampling to look at things. And so explain how sampling is now used. That wasn't used in the 40s, correct?
So the 1940, that's one of the other things that's important about 1940. This is the first time that the census itself starts to use some amount of sampling.
Okay.
And so the very first use of sampling by the federal government is, I think, in 1937 in a survey meant to try to gauge unemployment. Again, it's the middle of the Depression.
Yeah.
This is a contentious political question. The Census Bureau employs in 1940 not as a tool of trying to decrease the size of the census, but essentially as a way of trying to cheat the system. Like they filled up this entire gigantic piece of paper with questions. And Congress is like, we got a couple more things we want. Or like, and other experts are like, there's a few other questions we really want to know. And so like, all right, fine. Every, on each side of the sheet of paper, each of which has, see if I can show folks a picture of this. This is the front of the book.
Oh, there we go.
So it's this, but.
And so for those at home, we're looking at what a real page, now that's what the enumerator would be looking at?
This is what the enumerator was holding in a gigantic portfolio the size of a newspaper. And it would have on each side 40 rows and then 30 some columns of data that would be filled in for each person in those 40 rows. And then on each of those sides, there's 2 of the rows that have been highlighted, that have been darkened. And those are the sample rows. And a person who randomly falls in that sample row then is asked a series of other questions that show up at the very bottom of that sheet.
Gotcha.
So this is a 5% sample intended to then supplement the existing count. Okay. Once they figure out how to do this, though, both statisticians and government start to realize, oh, well, this could turn around the other direction as well. And especially increasingly because both people don't want to spend time answering these questions, and because of privacy concerns, like people don't want to give up all of this information, especially as the government is asking about more and more things that people might deem to be personal information. There's a real incentive to ask fewer people more questions. And so the decennial census every 10 years, its primary purpose is to do that complete and total count with
Mhm.
some very basic demographic figures, because you need to know, this is what we call the sample frame. You need to know at a basic level who everybody is and where they are. And once you have that basic framework, then you can pick out people according to the characteristics you're interested in and ask a small sample of those people a lot more questions and weight those results according to what the sample frame tells us. And from that, make these fairly accurate estimates of
Mhm.
what it is for the entire population. So the sampling is possible, and it's experimented first in the census. But the key thing about the census is that this decennial every 10-year census is necessary as the foundational layer upon which all this other data work builds.